Good morning. I'd like to introduce you to Steve. Steve lives in a small city just off the coast of Queensland, Australia. There are a few 100,000 inhabitants of the city where Steve lives, and his family has lived here for millennia. In fact, when Steve researched his family tree as part of a school project, he could trace his family line in this region back about 8,000 years. Yeah, and Steve's family and wider community has made an amazing contribution to the region. In so many ways, economically, Steve's community brought in 5.89 billion Australian dollars for the local economy last year. Environmentally, Steve is at the forefront of cleaning the oceans and ensuring healthy and diverse habitats for fish and for plant life. Emotionally, Steve and the wider community here bring a lot of people a lot of joy, memories they'll cherish forever. And Steve takes great pride in what he does. He doesn't have a high-flying job, but he knows that what he does is important. He knows that he is the present in a long line of ancestors. He's the humble leader of countless future generations to come. But Steve's way of life is at risk. There are many challenges that Steve and his community battle on a daily basis. Challenges that make their day-to-day arduous and draining. But more critical than that, challenges that make their future in this region uncertain. Steve hopes his descendants will have the opportunity to call this place home, but that's far from guaranteed. Oh, and if you're still looking for Steve, Steve's here. You see, it might have sounded like I was talking about a person, but Steve is actually a polyp. Steve's family and his wider community is a coral formation, a small part of the Great Barrier Reef. Today, we're going to discover more about the Great Barrier Reef, this world-famous but little understood phenomenon. And we'll come to realize not only how important it is for us as humans, but how similar it is to us as humans. Coral might be 200,000 years older than humanity, but it's striking how similar we are. But before we start to unpack how humans and coral really aren't that different from each other, let's situate ourselves in the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef spans a total area of approximately 133,000 square miles off the coast of Queensland, Australia. Known to Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders for tens and thousands of years, the reef has assumed important cultural and spiritual significance in traditional lore here. But it wasn't until 1770, with the naval arrival of Captain Cook, that Europeans discovered the reef's existence. Actually, Captain Cook discovered the reef's existence slightly more than he might have wished to, as his ship, the HMS Endeavour, ran aground on a shoal just south of present-day Cooktown. It took 7 weeks to repair the damage and refloat the ship. 32 years later, the reef was named by Matthew Flinders, who conducted a more detailed charting of the reef in 1802. The Great Barrier Reef, which reaches from the Torres Strait at the north to Lady Elliot Island at its southernmost point, consists of over 2,900 individual reefs and 900 islands. It's home to literally billions of polyps like Steve, as well as thousands of fish species and sea plants. More than 1,500 fish species live on the reef, including damselfish, angelfish, cardinal fish, and probably the one that everyone knows thanks to Finding Nemo, clownfish. There are also 17 species of sea snake on the Great Barrier Reef, 6 species of turtle use the reef as a breeding site, and 215 species of bird have been spotted on the reef. About 1.5 million birds use the Great Barrier Reef as a breeding ground each year. There's a huge ecosystem that has organically built itself around the Great Barrier Reef. not to mention the massive tourism pool of the region, which attracts 2.2 million visitors a year. That equates to 69,000 jobs. As reefs go, the Great Barrier Reef is relatively young. The current reef dates back about 8,000 years, with a reef thought to be in this location for about 500,000 years. But coral reefs have been around for over 500 million years. So this one, the largest in the world, is still relatively young. About 600 different types of coral live in the Great Barrier Reef, and we're going to look at a few different examples today, because not all polyps look the same. But despite not all polyps looking the same, there are more similarities than differences, and they are all at risk from the same dangers. As I've already suggested, polyps and people have a lot more in common than you might have first thought. And we're going to spend a good amount of time exploring those similarities. But first, some differences. If this is a barrier reef, what does that mean? And what are the other types of reefs out there? Well, there are four main types of coral reef: fringing reefs, patch reefs, atolls, and of course, barrier reefs. Now, fringing reefs are the most common type of reef. They grow near the coastline around islands and are separated from the shore by a narrow, shallow lagoon. The largest fringing coral reef in the world is Ningaloo Reef, just off the western coast of Australia. It's about 160 miles or 260 kilometers long. But there are fringing reefs all over the place. In the Caribbean, off the coast of East Africa, in the Red Sea. Now, patch reefs are isolated reefs that pop up separate from any mass structure. Oftentimes they're found between a fringing reef close to shore and a barrier reef slightly further out. They're called patch reefs because, well, that's just what they are. A patch here, a patch there. Now, there are loads of patch reefs in the warm, shallow waters off the south coast of Florida, or around the islands of the Bahamas or Bermuda. Atolls are rings of coral that create a protected lagoon, usually found in the middle of the ocean. These gorgeous lagoons are wrapped by a coral ring were typically, once upon a time, an island surrounded by a fringing reef. The island has succumbed to the sea, or sea levels have risen, resulting in the land disappearing, the coral reef surfacing. The largest coral atoll in the world is found in the very heart of the Pacific Ocean, just above the equator, a part of Kiribati. I think you might have been there. It's Christmas Island. Some of you. And finally, barrier reefs. Well, like fringing reefs, barrier reefs run parallel to the coastline but are separated by wider and deeper lagoons. Barrier reefs are relatively rare. At their shallower points, they can reach the water's surface, which creates a barrier to ships trying to pass, hence the name that they were given. And I guess the example here is obvious. The UNESCO World Heritage listed Belize Barrier Reef, the largest barrier reef in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, and the Great Barrier Reef, the largest organic structure in the world. The only animal creation visible from the moon. And an animal creation it is. Because even though a lot of people think that coral must be some kind of fossilized plant or maybe even a rock, coral is 100% an animal. It's in the same family as sea anemones and jellyfish. And just like other soft-body animals out there in the oceans, coral polyps have tentacles and stinging cells. In marine biolingo, nematocysts. All coral polyps have the same basic body structure, with tentacles and stinging cells surrounding a mouth at the top of their central body cavity. But, as we know, that doesn't mean that all coral formations look the same. At its most simplified, there are two types of corals: hard coral and octocorals, which are also known as soft corals. Now, hard coral polyps have 6 tentacles, or tentacles in multiples of 6, and they excrete calcium carbonate, which hardens to create a rigid skeleton. living polyps take up residence on the surface of ever-growing coral structures because they generally need sunlight for survival. Soft corals, or octocorals on the other hand, have 8 tentacles. They keep a flexible skeleton that dances gently in the swell. Their central core is formed by a protein called gorgonin. The outer layer is called the rind, and it's in the rind that new polyps embed themselves. Both types of coral use their tentacles to capture food, and their favourite meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is plankton. Each polyp is only 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter and a few centimeters tall. But eating is a huge part of a polyp's day, and most of a polyp's body is taken up by its stomach. If we were to be a little derogatory about our friend Steve, he's just a bit of a plankton sack. Big Belly Steve, that's what his mates call him. His mate, Super Stomach Sandra, Tubby Tummy Tim. It's just something about being a polyp. So, a coral group, or a colony, it's not just the British who colonised Australian waters, is a group of genetically identical polyps. And when they group together, they look great and they do amazing things. Let's take a look at some examples. Flowerpot corals, or Goniopora stokesi, if you want to sound like you really know what you're talking about, are some of the most beautiful corals out there. They almost look like an overflowing flower pot of daisies. Each polyp is tipped with 24 stinging tentacles around their mouth. In the Great Barrier Reef, you'll find flowerpot corals in the shallower waters, about 5 to 25 meters deep in the upper reef slopes. Now, flowerpot corals don't like strong waves, but smooth cauliflower coral is perfectly happy with a good bit of surf. It's known in the scientific world as Stylophora pistillata. This hard coral can be found up to a depth of about 15 meters. It's got a distinctive flattened end finish. Native to the Indo-Pacific region, smooth cauliflower coral is on the near threatened list, but its population is currently stable. But perhaps one of the more striking forms of coral present in the Great Barrier Reef is finger coral, also known as Montipora digitata. This stony coral grows like a winter tree with stark, upright branches. Found in shallow environments, this coral is known for its rough sandpaper texture. Not that you should ever touch the coral. But even though coral colonies might look like a brightly coloured spindly tree or a flower pot overflowing with daisies, corals are animals. So, how do they reproduce if they don't move from their colony? Coral reproduces in 2 ways, sexually and asexually. You might not believe me yet, but that's just the same as humans. Let's start with sexual reproduction, which actually isn't a polyp's preference. In fact, coral only reproduces sexually once a year by way of broadcast insemination. Check out this video.
Coral spawning, in essence, is actually the Great Barrier Reef breeding. The Great Barrier Reef stretches 2,600 kilometers from just south of Bundaberg right up to Papua New Guinea. This reef is incredibly huge and it breeds in the same 2 or 3 nights. Nothing like it on the planet. Corals, as a tiny little jellyfish style animal, actually reproduce in 2 ways. They reproduce for the majority of the year asexually, where they actually split and divide, asexual reproduction. However, coral spawning is their sexual reproduction. That pretty much corals are having babies. But the way they do it, because it's so large, they do what we call broadcast synchronized spawning. They throw bundles of sperm and egg into the water. To synchronize it, we as researchers have actually worked out a few of the main cues. The major environmental cues that we look for is the full moon around the November period, and then we go 2 to 6 nights after that. And what we're looking for in that period is the smallest tide range. We don't want a lot of current. The reason for that, all that genetic material can float up and have a chance to mingle, and for the right individuals to find the right individuals, so to speak. A few nights later, the tides and the winds start dispersing it across the whole reef.
Once a year, in November, polyps release sperm and eggs into the water. The genetic material meets and mingles and spawns little swimming polyp tadpoles. These tadpoles have one task: find something to colonize, get there and build a colony. And so, with that colony building in mind, most of the time, coral polyps reproduce asexually via a process called budding. Essentially, they create a clone of themselves and pop, there's another totally identical polyp. And how is that the same as humans? Well, I guess the sexual reproduction part is a fairly obvious comparison. Once a year. Even if most of us don't broadcast our genetics in quite the same way as coral does. But asexually, can a human really reproduce asexually? It's a fair question. So consider this. When you started, you had 2 cells. Your body is today made up of about 100 million cells. Where do you think 99,999,999,999,998 of those cells came from? They came from those first 2 splitting, then splitting again, then again, and again. Throughout our life, our cells divide. They create clones of themselves. Same with polyps. The main difference is that we keep our skeleton inside, they grow an exoskeleton around each new polyp. But we're both, humans and polyps, a biological combination of genetic inheritance and miraculous self-starter. There's another way we reproduce asexually, away from the biological for a moment. And that's through our ideas, our conversations, our relationships. We are the amalgamation of those we choose to hold dear to us, and in return we offer something of ourselves to them. Because where we're not the same as polyps is we are a cognizant being. We grow not just physically, but intellectually, philosophically, emotionally. And that doesn't come from a night of amour. Neither does it come from a connective tissue cell cloning itself. It comes from relationships and meaningful connections. But if we were to try and solidify that into a physical representation, an object or a sculpture that could represent the generations of social and cultural influences that each of us carries around with us every day, we could do a lot worse than turning to a coral colony as that image. And we're going to come back to that thought in a bit. But before that, something you've probably noticed about any corals you've seen while snorkeling, or even in an aquarium, is how colourful they are. So what makes corals so colourful? And what's this thing called coral bleaching? Well, first about the colour. Coral polyps alone wouldn't be nearly as colourful. They wouldn't be as beautiful. Yes, they'd still arrange themselves into funky-shaped colonies, but a snorkeling excursion would be more like swimming through a blank colouring in sheet rather than a Technicolor masterpiece. And this is because corals get their colours from a friend. Friendship, a symbiotic relationship with a microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. It's the zooxanthellae that gives coral its vivid colour. And here's how that works. As we already know, coral polyps are hungry creatures. They love to eat. But they're also a bit of a homebod, very family-oriented. A polyp never leaves the family colony, certainly not by choice anyway. So how's a polyp supposed to eat if he can't bear to leave his family and head out to the grocery store? Well, the submarine version of online supermarket deliveries is to entice the food to come to you. And that's what polyps do. They provide a home for microscopic algae within their tissue. Now, they don't eat the algae. It's cleverer than that. The algae needs a home, the polyp needs to eat. But polyps are carnivores. So the algae settles in and creates nutrients through photosynthesis. The algae, a plant species, turns the coral's exoskeleton all those beautiful colors. And because it creates all these juicy nutrients too, plankton turns up to feast. Well, that's the perfect moment for a famished little coral polyp like Steve to reach out with one of its stinging tentacles and go to town. And it's because of this symbiotic relationship between the coral and the algae that the coral is usually found in fairly shallow waters. Not because the polyps love the sun, but because their lodger, the algae zooxanthellae, needs sunlight to photosynthesize and therefore attract food. That's the food cycle, and that's the root of a wonderfully multicolored coral reef. But why, you might be wondering, is so much coral white? Why doesn't the algae turn that coral nice colors too? Well, once upon a time, it did. The thing with coral, which is also similar to humans, is that the present generation builds on the foundations of their forefathers. White coral is either dying or dead, but it still exists. Now, first thoughts, you might say something needs to be alive to continue growing and giving. But that's not true. Not true for polyps, not true for us. The vast majority of any coral reef you will ever see lived hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago. At one point, those polyps were full of vibrant color. They were the cutting edge. They were the trendsetters. They formed the path for the current generation of polyps. And they're still there, supporting the whole colony. It's exactly the same for us. To use my own family as an example, I was brought up by my parents, yeah, but also by my grandparents, and a real blessing also by my great-grandparents. But more than that, I was brought up with the lessons and values of my great-great-grandparents, a generation that died decades before I was born. I know who they are, I know where they came from, I know what they stood for. And that's because whether it's a direct family or wider community, we are all the present tense of something much, much bigger, with an extraordinary history. We all carry a legacy of hundreds of years, and we're all writing more of it every day. Whether it's for our individual children or other connections makes little difference. Our decisions, our actions, our thoughts today will shape our world for generations. And it's the exact same thing for polyps. But I want to take a moment to talk about the darker side of all of this. Obviously, everything has a lifespan. But what are the threats to coral that caused over half of the Great Barrier Reef's coral cover to die between 1995 and 2017? Surely that's not just nature running its course. It is, and it isn't. This brings us to coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is the term given to a section of a reef all turning white at the same time. It's expected that individual polyps will die here and there every day. But a whole colony, even a whole reef, surely that doesn't sound right. It's fair to say that the world's corals are under threat. And we're going to tackle some of the key challenges that our corals face today. But first, a crash course in coral bleaching. White coral doesn't always mean that the coral has died. But if it is still alive, it's under a huge amount of stress, and without a change in the environment, it will die. There are 4 primary environmental factors that lead to coral bleaching: a change in ocean temperature, pollution and land runoff, overexposure to sunlight, and extreme low tides, taking the coral out of the water and therefore exposing it to air. When a coral polyp becomes stressed, it's unable to support its side of the symbiotic relations it has with its lodger, zooxanthellae. Put this into a human context for a moment, and it's exactly the same. A hugely stressful period at work often results in a person being able to give less to their personal relationships outside of work, not because they don't value their relationships, but because there's just no energy left. Well, if the algae isn't receiving what it needs from the relationship, it will leave and float off in search of a new home. It's a fickle friend. But of course, when the algae departs, it takes its vibrant colors and delicious photosynthesized nutrients with it. And there's the kicker. When the algae leaves, it takes away the coral polyp's food source, plankton. Because let's be fair, the plankton weren't coming to the reef to be dinner. They were coming for dinner. And the chef de jour has left the building. And over a period, bleached coral starves, and it becomes a monument to its own fall and glory. But with a change of environmental factors, there's every possibility that a new polyp could one day settle on the foundations of this ancient coral Atlantis and revive what was once there. In just the same way, people are today picking up ancient Greek or Egyptian ideas of civilizations long gone, and replaying them with the modern context, making groundbreaking new discoveries and scientific strides. A multi-millennia collaboration. Hopefully you've been a little surprised today. Hopefully a little bit more of the Great Barrier Reef's great mystery and intrigue has been revealed. But perhaps more than that, I hope that the next time you admire a beautiful piece of coral, you can see it in some way as a mirror to the wonderful things that we can achieve in harmony as a group. The beautiful home we can provide to those who need our support, just as coral supports thousands of fish, birds, plant species, and the importance of respecting where we've come from, are part of our present as well as our future. If you've got any questions about life on the reef, Steve the Polyp will be joining us as our special coffee chat guest tomorrow. And by the way, you've got 288 million cells in your body right now that didn't exist half an hour ago. Thank you for coming.